Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the second day of our conference on Mod Gothic. My name is Tom Nickson, if you weren't here yesterday, and I'll be chairing these sessions, which once again will work as pairs of papers, each of about 30 minutes, with time for questions and discussion afterwards. And do please put any questions that you might have into the chat, and I will try to read them out so that we can have some kind of discussion after the papers. So as yesterday, I'm not going to formally introduce the speakers, but they will say a few words about their first encounters with PK and with Paul. I will just briefly say that our first speaker today is Zoe Parchich, who's Senior Lecturer in the History and Theory of Architecture at Birkbeck, and she prepared her paper jointly with Klára Benešovská of the Czech Academy of Sciences. Zoe's research on the art and architecture of Prague and Central Europe means that in many ways she's Paul Crossley's kind of closest intellectual heir in many ways. And she was co-editor, in fact, of the 2-volume collection of essays offered to Paul in 2012. She was also, I should say, a close friend of Paul's, and together with Alexandra Gajewski, she has really helped to shape this conference. I'm really grateful to her. Her paper considers axes of meaning, Paul Crossley and Gothic Bohemia.
Thank you very, very much for a very generous introduction. I will now attempt to make. Okay, so again, many thanks, Tom, for the invitation to participate in this august event, which feels, I would say, rather personal to many of us. I ought to stress, however, that this contribution, unlike the excellent papers yesterday, is not about my own research, although my research and academic career were fundamentally shaped by the intellectual journey I will attempt to sketch out today. My talk also, I think, sets the scene for several Paul-centered presentations this afternoon that I personally very much look forward to. I should also say, and Tom has already mentioned this, that although I had a privilege to follow and benefit from Paul's profound fascination with medieval Bohemia almost from its inception, this paper could not have been written without the knowledgeable input of Klára Benešovská, who is currently chairing her own conference in Prague, and Jana Gajdošová, who is, I think, here, and I thank both very much. And I also extend sincere thanks to Alexandra Gajewski, John McNeill, Delia Gaze, and Gillian Malpass. Paul, as we all know, was a versatile scholar who published and especially taught a very wide range of subjects. Some of his interests, for example, his love of German Baroque architecture, were shared more privately. You may be surprised to hear that it was to Balthasar Neumann's Abbey church at Neresheim, rather than Prague, Krakow, or Wels, that Paul most eagerly wanted to return to in the last years of his life. Nevertheless, his work on Prague and Bohemia during the relatively brief but extraordinarily prolific era of the Luxembourg dynasty occupied the longest and possibly the most fertile period of his scholarly output. I always imagined Paul's encounter with Prague to have been something of a revelation during his lengthy stays as a doctoral student in Krakow. Klára Benešovská thought that this might have occurred close to the time of Prague's brutally curtailed spring of 1968. But as Paul only arrived to Krakow in 1969, I'm sure we'll hear more about this very soon, it is more likely to have taken place in the early 1970s. Now, I'm kicking myself that I have never actually asked him, but somehow he also never mentioned it, despite regaling us all for years with anecdotes of his adventures around East and West Germany and Poland, when pan-European travel was almost as difficult as it is today. What is certain is that by the time of the publication of his still seminal work on architecture of Lesser Poland in the time of Casimir the Great, he understood the connections and artistic exchanges that existed between the two realms, and also the overwhelming regional influence of Prague. There was, for example, the example of St. Catherine's, founded by Casimir the Great in his new district of Krakow, named Kazimierz, and given over to the Augustinian friars, who came from the mother house of St. Thomas in Prague. As Paul Crossley argued, the choice of order was not unusual in Central European court circles. Both Charles IV and Casimir the Great seem to have shown a particular devotion to it, which in Casimir's case led to the foundation of two more friaries in Velun and Opus. But the resemblance between Prague and Casimir's friaries extended beyond their royal pedigree. The imposing apsidal choir of St. Catherine's, together with the east wing of the monastery, the earliest part to be completed, conforms to the local municipal style of architecture formulated by St. Mary's Church in Krakow's Old Town Square. Yet, as Paul has shown, the particular geometry of the apse, which describes 7 sides of a dodecagon, also lines this structure with the flagship Augustinian friars churches of Prague, Brno, Litomyšl, and Wrocław. Clearly, the influence did not only flow in one direction. Casimir's urban taking of at Kazimierz, which you see here, and actually this is just down there is the new town. So Kazimier's urban outtaking at Kazimierz foreshadowed that of Charles IV's new town almost by a decade, including the form of some of its whole churches, such as the double-aisled Our Lady of the Lawn. Ultimately, elucidating the formal and patronal interplay between these two Slavonic capitals has led Paul towards a deeper study of the sacred topography of rulership staged across the cathedral and the city in both Prague and Krakow. On a more general level, Lesser Poland, Krakow, and regional networks that stretched across Central Europe provided one of 2 early inroads for Paul into Bohemia. The second came through his fascination and in some case early first-hand knowledge of German Gothic architecture, which led him to the omnipresent wunderkind that was Peter Kidson. This was the path charted in Paul Crossley's 2 earliest publications, which placed Prague and Bohemia more centrally in his research, and in them he approached Bohemian Gothic from 2 opposing directions. In his 1981 contribution to the BAA conference proceedings, and by all accounts a memorable paper delivery, entitled Wells, the West Country and Central European Late Gothic, Paul challenged, with some irony, the European perspective of Pevsner, Klaassen, and Bock, which identified England as the source of many of Paul's most idiosyncratic ideas, and the West Country, as in Paul's words, the grandparent to German Sondergothic. While accepting that it would be perverse to dismiss so many close English parallels as lucky coincidences, Paul argued for a simultaneous and autonomous development and pointed to difficulty of Paul's travel to England and the incongruity of dates. He proposed a German and Central European solution to the Paula conundrum via Rhenish Renat workshops, the so-called Magdeburg Tonsur at Cloister Chapel, and Cistercian architecture in Bohemia and Poland, while conceding the possibility of a transfer of ideas via lost drawings and of English monuments. The net of architectural influences cast by Paul is, if anything, more ambitious and challenging than a short stay in England may have been. However, the article transcended the question of cross-channel influence, offering instead a majestic and tightly argued overview of the development of German and Central European Gothic from the 13th century Baltic to the 15th century Vienna. Just like the talented architect whose career Paul set to map out, the article demonstrated his own outstanding ability to bring together and transform ideas from very different sources. This is a quote. A very different model of architectural networking was explored in his 1997 essay, The Architecture of Queenship, Royal Saints, Female Dynasties, and the Spread of Gothic Architecture in Central Europe, published in the volume Queens and Queenship in Medieval Europe. Here, Paul Crossley followed a close-knit group of patrons, enthusiastic promoters of Gothic architecture, whose projects can be seen as early conduits of French forms into Central Eastern Germany, Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary. These, however, were not kings or clerics, but aristocratic women. St. Elizabeth of Hungary, sorry, you've seen that already, let's move on to St. Elizabeth. St. Elizabeth of Hungary, St. Hedwig of Silesia, St. Agnes of Bohemia, and Queen Elizabeth Riketza or Reška. Almost all were related directly or through marriage, and their churches, often their final resting places, in Marburg, Trebnica, Wrocław, Prague, and Brno, inaugurated new and sophisticated forms of Gothic design, including tall and long polygonal choirs and multifaceted windows. Above all, their choices, argued Paul, were driven by specific kind of decorum, simultaneously innovative in the case of St. Hedwig, deliberately retrospective through a number of knowing quotations of the Marburg Shrine Church. As well as respect, in Paul's argument, architecture could also articulate animosity. This was the case of two Elizabeths and two early 14th century Cistercian foundations in Bohemia, Elizabeth Przemyslovna, the mother of Charles IV, whose family's Aula Regia in Zbraslav favored a square-ended choir in the style of Sito, and Elizabeth Riketza, Polish-born former Queen of Bohemia, whose personal foundation of Aula Sancta Maria in Brno preferred the trefoil east end and trefoil east end arrangement, and thus, in Paul's analysis, like its patron, stood as an outsider and denied in form and material everything that Zbraslav stood for. And while Riketza seemed to architecturally unfriend the Przemyslids, she, the argument goes, gravitated towards her Polish roots, looking at Wrocław and Silesia for her models. Now, I will pause here because at this juncture, another important female expert of Central European Gothic architecture entered Paul's scholarly life. Klára Benešovská is cited here halfway down as being rightly, I think, skeptical of Paul's pro-Silesian reading of the Aula at Stare Brno. But their encounter and subsequent collaborations, joint supervisions, and meetings had a formative effect on Paul's writing, research, and doctoral students. This and other encounters between scholars across Europe's ideological divide were only possible following the momentous political changes in the early 1990s, and it marked Paul's return to Central European scholarship. Klára Benešovská recalls the extraordinary atmosphere of the 1992 CIHA conference in Berlin, which Betsy referred to yesterday as not being able to come in and hear Paul's lecture. But in particular with the late, sadly, and great Robert Zuccale reaching out to Central European scholars who were hitherto not allowed to travel abroad, but were now able to share the podium with their Western colleagues. By the time of the Jagiellonian Conference in 1999, organized by the newly founded Institute for the History and Culture in Central Europe, or the GVCDO, in Kutná Hora, Paul had also met Jerzy Veit, the then director of the medieval section of the National Gallery in Prague, and soon to become the head of the GVCDO. It was Jerzy who would involve Paul in a number of ambitious international projects, including the sellout Charles IV exhibitions in New York and Prague in 2005 and 2006. Paul was completely in his element on these occasions, and many followed, meeting old friends, forming new acquaintances, seamlessly moving between languages and different, sometimes tribal groups of academics, introducing sessions, brilliantly summing up often hard to follow arguments, encouraging young scholars. These encounters also helped him to reevaluate his own research and tap into hitherto inaccessible Central European scholarship and resources. In 2001, the conference convened in Schwäbisch Gmünd on the occasion of the 650th anniversary of the foundation of the Church of the Holy Cross, a monument also attributed to Peter Parler, brought together almost 40 international experts and gave Paul Crossley an opportunity to revisit and revise fundamentally his argument about Peter Parler in England. Published in the prestigious Wallach Richards Jahrbuch of 2003, with an emphatic acknowledgement to Norbert Nussbaum, Peter Parler in England, a problem revisited, returned to the Parler conundrum, or the Glaubensfragen, as Paul termed it. while finding the Boni-Panofsky model of the English architectural superiority in the decorated period simplistic, he nonetheless set out to demonstrate through forensic scrutiny of the West Country vaults and Prague Cathedral choir elevation, not only that their conceptual similarity was greater than previously thought, but that it could have only occurred as a result of a first-hand experience. Furthermore, the decorated did not provide Peter Parle only with the solutions to complex problems presented by the Triforium of Prague Cathedral. With its imaginative freedom and its wide repertoire of decorative forms, it, in Paul's words, aligned itself neatly, unexpectedly, to the eclectic and experimental tastes of Charles IV and the cathedral clergy. Rarely has a medieval scholar so vigorously argued with a younger self. However, the article clearly demonstrates Paul's growing depth of understanding acquired at first hand of the choir of Prague Cathedral. Moreover, it also acknowledges his indebtedness to the work of Christopher Wilson in England, of Klára Benešovská's study of the choir's first architect Matthias of Arras, Mark Carroll Shaw's PhD and then a book on Peter Parle, and Peter Korman's work on the Upper Rhine and Saalen. I should also mention as a postscript that Christopher Wilson responded to this article in a compellingly argued essay entitled "Why Did Peter Parle Come to England?" published as a tribute in the Liber Amicorum for Paul. It was not only Paul's research, but also his teaching that benefited immediately from this new era of openness and cooperation. Lucy Wright, later Ormerod, was the first Courtauld student since Amanda Simpson to take on a Bohemian topic with her thesis on the Wenceslaus Chapel in Prague Cathedral. Lucy learned Czech and spent many months in Prague under Klára's co-supervision, a winning formula enthusiastically followed by several of Paul's doctoral students. In Paul's Courtauld teaching, Charles IV's patronage now became part of the canon, taking its justly deserved place alongside that of the Plantagenets and the Valois. This very topic was the subject of my 1994 MA course entitled, with a characteristically poetic flair, The Spectacle of Romance, Architecture and Representation in England, France, and Germany in the later Middle Ages. The lucky 7 of us who attended the course had the privilege to hear Paul's developing ideas and discuss them with him. Nevertheless, finding relevant material to read and in languages that most of us could cope with was a challenge. Paul shared his books, mostly 1970s glossy monographs in perplexing English translation, and translated himself sometimes overnight, posting fresh copies in the famous Courtauld library box. Lucy generously shared her own lengthy translations of the up-to-date Czech publications, though looking at my notes, occasionally things were not quite well photocopied by Paul, and it was a bit of a hit and miss. Still, this hot off the press aspect of our course contributed to our perception that we were discovering something genuinely new, exotic, and yet international, rich in scale and meaning, and worth exploring. I clearly remember the moment in the Courtauld library when I came across, in a footnote, a monastery founded by Charles IV in Prague's new town and populated by Croatian monks who used Old Church Slavonic language. I had not yet been to Prague, but this seemed like a sign. Similar epiphanies brought on by Paul's charismatic teaching, as well as the wealth of material, the opportunities to travel and research in the welcoming parts of, from the Western perspective at least, underexplored medieval Europe, sent Achim Timmerman, Agnieszka Rożniowska-Sadrai, Andreas Put, Tim Jukes, and Jana Gajdosheva on lengthy study trips abroad. This new generation of cosmopolitan scholars and their work on medieval Germany, Poland, Austria, Bohemia, and Upper Hungary have made and continue to make a profound contribution to the scholarship in Central Europe and are a testimony of Paul's lasting legacy as a teacher. And I think I can say this, what he was most proud of. It would be fair to say that Paul's doctoral supervisions were also exchanges of ideas, and that his own publications were enriched by them, something he was always the first to acknowledge. At the same time, Paul's own outlook on Gothic Bohemia became more holistic, and his interest shifted from the creative genius of Peter Klára and its Masonic roots to the creative relationship between Charles IV, his inner and outer court circles, and his artists. This allowed Paul to embrace more fully all aspects of medieval Prague and what he saw as Charles IV's exceptional political, cultural, and spiritual persona. The eccentricities of Prague Cathedral could no longer be explained solely by the cosmopolitan Leerjahre of Peter Klára. It was, stated Paul, more than any other single agent. It was Charles, stated Paul, more than any other single agent who imposed on Peter Klára's Prague Lodge the idiosyncratic and disruptive demands of all truly creative patrons. Charles IV's creative vision, which changed and became more ambitious in the course of his reign, became the focus of three major essays published in around 2000, Bohemia Sacra, Liturgy and History of Prague Cathedral, from where I just quoted, The Politics of Presentation, the Architecture of Charles IV, and Prague as the New Capital, which we wrote together for the Prague and the Crown of Bohemia catalogue, which accompanied 2005 New York Met exhibition. It was actually then republished in a German and Czech version of the catalogue. While the first looked to Charles IV's own complex upbringing, his fascination with St. Wenceslas, and with the sacred royal ritual as an explanation for the many oddities of Prague Cathedral, the second expanded the canvas beyond the single building and into an urban, though still liturgical experience. The sense of architecture as theatre, with an associative and retrospective decorum, which can be activated through ceremony, was at the heart of Paul's argument about Prague's new town. His reading of Charles IV's colossal new district as a copy, in a very medieval sense, of Jerusalem may have been based on William Lawrence's landmark 1973 study, but Paul gave it infinitely more substance and nuance. His detection of the two principal axes of meaning in the new town planning, the Bohemian axis, which basically ran from the castle through the old town, past Charles Square, the Mayor's Monastery to Vyšehrad, and then back again, and the universal axis centered on Charles Square, which you see here and here with a Corpus Christi chapel used for relic displays. With their own carefully, so these two axes, the Bohemian and the universal, each with their own carefully situated architectural memoria, offered a genuinely new insight, which over the years became a definitive reading. It also placed the conceptual solutions of Prague on a par with those of Siena and Florence, the latter discussed in similar axial and scenic terms in Marvin Trachtenberg's The Dominion of the Eye. Paul was not an urban historian, and his interests remained firmly in the realm of religious architecture. But this joined up reading of Prague Cathedral, Karlstein Castle, and the new town opened up broader geographies beyond the single iconic building and demonstrated that architecture can be understood and experienced sequentially as a movement through compressed time, as well as temporarily suggestive space. This illusion of space and time became one of the themes of Paul's last public lectures, delivered as a part of the Slade Lecture Series in Cambridge in 2012, and we have Paul Binsky to thank for those. In examining the similarities between the topography and ritual in Prague and Krakow cathedrals, Paul homed in on their respective coronation ordinals, which in his words, revolve around the importance of place, of sites and their histories, and both set out to correlate architecture with time. For Paul, it was liturgy that ultimately had the power to transform the rigidities of stable architecture into kinetic meaning. And I think there are resonances here with Alexandra Gajewski's paper yesterday. The substantial part of this lecture was based on the paper Bohemia Sacra and Polonia Sacra, Liturgy and History in Prague and Krakow Cathedrals, dedicated to Paul's former Polish mentor, Lech Kalinowski, who was also honored with a conference in Poland only last week. With hindsight, it can be seen as a premature end of a circle which began with his arrival in Krakow in 1969. Paul's legacy in Central Europe cannot be underestimated. In the preparation of this paper, Klára Benešovská reflected on the formative influence that their conversations, especially on site, had on her research and thinking. His encyclopedic knowledge of buildings, his genuine openness to discussion, and his abilities to cast familiar material in a wholly new light made Paul a highly respected honorary member of Czech academia, who was also universally liked. For English readers and students of medieval architecture, he opened new horizons for research and international cooperation and expanded university curricula. Above all, it was his writing, vivid, luminous, compelling. Reading Paul on Bohemia or any other subject was an intellectual vade-mecum, from which the reader emerged not only a great deal more informed about Gothic world, but also somehow improved. I can think of few authors who could, as Paul Crossley did in the conclusion of the Politics of Presentation, move seamlessly between the demise of the Golden Prague to the afterlife of the great church in Spain, in the Low Countries and Germany, to its resurrection in the scenic Baroque in one brief paragraph. These were not sweeping statements of an art historian of the old school, but invitations for further discussion and discovery. For Paul, the end was always the beginning of another journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for a really kind of masterly summary of Paul's interventions in that field. Lots of memories of reading those articles myself. But we will have questions, as I said before, at the end of the pair of papers. So we turn now to our second speaker, who will offer a kind of complementary paper. Our speaker is Thomas Veklavitz, who is professor in the history of art at the University of John Paul II in Krakow, and is an old and much loved friend of Paul's from Poland. And today he will speak about Paul Crossley's Fascinations, Gothic in Lesser Poland.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your kind invitation at first. I have known Paul for a few decades, and today I would like to say a few words about what was his favorite group of architectural monuments in Lesser Poland, taking into account how he struggled to analyze their features and meaning. If I remember well, Paul came to Krakow for a 4-year internship in autumn 1969. He was taken care by Professor Peter Kidson and George Ranecki from the Courtauld Institute and by Professor Lech Kalinowski from the Krakow University. The aim of his research was to develop the architecture of the Krakow Cathedral church in terms of style, details, and phenomenon of the pillar battle structure. Indeed, the state of research on Gothic architecture of Krakow and Lesser Poland was outdated at the time. The main studies were published at the beginning of the 20th century. Later, after the Second World War, it was a paradox, but both the communist Polish state and the Catholic Church supported research on pre-Romanesque and Romanesque art. In 1966, the 1000th anniversary of the baptism of the Polish Duke was celebrated. That event was commonly understood as the beginning of the Polish statehood by including Poland into Western European Christianitas. The long-term program of historical and archaeological research was called the Millennium Research. So, our knowledge on Gothic art did not develop then. Paul quickly learned Polish language to read books, papers, and written sources, and to get around the city as well. Even later, for many years, he spoke Polish fluently, without any foreign accent. You probably know that Polish language is very difficult for foreigners in terms of lexis and grammar. As you know, Paul played piano and violin, and besides that he was a very hardworking boy, he had so-called an ear for music, so that's why his pronunciation was perfect. When Paul came to Poland, he knew little about Polish medieval architecture. He took with him only some old, outdated publications from the Courtauld Institute photo archive. However, he quickly became fascinated with the Gothic architecture of Krakow. Apart from the Cathedral church, which is small but with a very decorative rayonnant detail, he was much impressed by the tall basilical churches with long choirs. The interiors are nearly 30 meters high. 4 of them have survived in Gothic forms. Therefore, Paul enlarged, let us say, the scope of his research topic and included the tall St. Mary's choir in his doctoral consideration. By the way, walking in the center of Krakow, I'm always surprised how and why these high choirs with great windows dominated the medieval town, in contrast to a low cathedral church. However, they were built in the same time. Paul traveled a lot around southern Poland, namely Lesser Poland. There he was impressed by small double-nave churches. Over a dozen were founded by the king in the middle of the 14th century, and a few were preserved in a previous state. These churches have pillars placed in the in the nave axis, supporting decorative tri-radial vaults. In smaller churches, there is one pillar only. In larger ones, 2 or even 3 pillars in a row. They were built mostly in small towns. Paul did not know then, when he was in the 70s, that later research and excavation revealed the remains of some dozen similar churches in Krakow Old Town. Of all these, only the Holy Cross Church survived in its original state. It has tri-radial nave vault supported by central pillar. In any case, during his trips over Lesser Poland, these churches fascinated him most. So he divided his doctoral thesis into 3 parts. The first concerned on the Cathedral Church, the second on the St. Mary's choir, and the last one touched double-nave churches outside Krakow. Small double-nave churches. However, they were not secondary and provincial works of architecture. They were built at the same time as the Cathedral Church, and they share some workshop features with the Krakow Cathedral. Many scholars have considered the origin of the double nave with axial pillars and the phenomenon of its popularity in Central Europe. The links have been shown to Austrian mendicant churches like Imbach, Dürnstein, and Enns, and to some Bohemian churches, for example, in Milicin, Trzeboń, and Bawor. A few single-pillar churches survive in the Hungarian Zips, now in Slovakia. However, they have not decorative tri-radial, but simple cross vaults. Pointing out the royal patronage, some Polish scholars proposed that Middle European architecture of the 14th century could be connected by a common artistic program inspired by the Emperor Court of Charles IV in Prague and royal courts of Louis the Great in Buda and Casimir the Great in Krakow. Therefore, the term court style has been proposed in analogy to the well-known invented term by Robert Branner. However, Paul was skeptic and emphasized differences in historical circumstances. He pointed out only some mutual inspiration, but only a few. Despite that, later in the 1990s, we often discussed with Paul in Krakow or in his Bedford house the potential type patterns for such churches. We considered the austere papal foundation in Avignon and the missing example of Hungarian churches. The last one, maybe they were not important. In the mid-14th century, the King of Poland had close ties both with the papal court and with the court of the Anjou dynasty in Hungary. Among these double nave churches, Paul was most fascinated by the collegiate church in Wiślica. Many times when he dropped in to Krakow, he asked me to take him to Wiślica. He loved to sit there inside and contemplate this white structure of plastered walls, stone details, and abstract linear scheme of tri-radial ribbed walls. This is actually a result of purist renovation of the 60s. However, the original artistic character was different, as you can suppose. The slender space was full of vibrant colors of polychromed walls and probably crowded with colorful triptychs. Maybe Paul would not like such a space, I don't know. Indeed, Wiślica Collegiate Church is a very spectacular work of architecture that attracted not only Paul's attention, but at similar times also an American researcher, Walter Leedy of Cleveland University. He died some 10 or 12 years ago. In 1969, he delivered a paper during the 22nd International Congress of the Art History in Budapest, but his paper was published in 1973. It means just after Paul's research. As far as I know, Leedy no longer continued his consideration later. He had concerted on a social background of foundations. The exterior from Wiślica Church is simple, smooth, and rather austere. Differences in rhythm as well as size are seen in two main parts, the nave and the choir. These two various solids, however, create an integrated whole. For example, the buttresses of the nave and choir are all the same size. The sill profile under the window level rounds around the exterior, tying the nave and choir together, and helps the church to achieve some visual unity. This sill profile is very common in those royal foundations of that time. The interior character does not reflect on the exterior. Stone on the exterior is in direct opposition to the interior. On the inside, despite the details of pillars, windows, ribs, and corbels, stone is not visible. The walls are plastered, intended to fresco, which were preserved partly preserved inside the choir only. No vault shafts, no other details are present in the wall surface themselves. So the vaulting developed independently from the walls. The vaulting patterns of the nave are composed of the three interlocking stars, consisted of triradial elements. They create together a very expressive composition and actually unify the interior space. The interior is composed of the nave and the choir. They are obviously joined together. However, they are different in conception as well as in function. The space of the nave is decorative and full of expression, but the choir follows the traditional pattern of the cross-vaulted rectangular base with a polygonal apse. The main reason for the difference between the nave and choir lies, of course, in their use by different groups of people, the clergy and the laity. For the clergy, the main focus was the altar. For the laity, beyond the traditional individual piety, there were also important reliefs on vault bosses with the coat of arms of the knightly families and coat of arms of lands of the kingdom. The collegial church in Wiślica, there was not a parochial church for common people. Only the knights of Lesser Poland and the higher clergy participated in religious ceremonies. Nearby, on the other side of this little town, there was a small castle where the king resided sometimes. Since Paul saw the Wiślica church for the first time, he tried to look for the iconographic explanation for such a type of the sacred space. Indeed, the axial pillar structures executed by royal masons became common models. Their popularity can be seen as the evidence of the strong influence of King Foundation, or rather as an expression of royal connotation. On the other hand, however, this type of church interior may have also developed in a response to a new spiritual climate of the late Middle Ages. Some years ago, I proposed the thesis based on the four-stage biblical exegesis. So in the literal meaning, the central stone pillar simply supports the vault. Next, it can be seen as an allegory of the true cross, but in moral, tropological interpretation as the tree of paradise. And finally, the anagogical interpretation understands the pillar with 12 ribs as the tree standing in the middle of heavenly Jerusalem, as we seen by St. John in his vision of the Last Judgment. But Paul always tried to be careful and precise. He struggled with this problem for a long time. However, he was afraid of overinterpretation. He often repeated after Max Dvorak that nothing in art is ever isolated. Every event and every creation is connected by 1,000 references to the culture in which it is set in. In his paper of 1986, he stated that there is a concealed trap lying in the path of any architectural historian bent on analysis of meaning. It is to confuse the method of iconology with those of iconography. These two methods look at the work of architecture from very different standpoints. The iconologists tend to see it from a greater distance as a part of a broad and unified pattern of civilization. On the other hand, the iconographers examine it much closer. So they are not concerned to fit into any wider cultural structure. Both methods are actually useful and distinct tools for the architectural historian, but they must not be confused, he pointed out. The iconologist can make general inferences about the meaning of building only after he has used the conclusion of the iconographer's method. The iconographer, on the other hand, must not place himself too close to the building and its history. He must be able to use the current knowledge of medieval culture. Finally, Paul liked to emphasize that the gap between iconographers and iconologists is rarely bridged, and perhaps for this reason, he used to say, after Otto von Simpson, I guess, that he was always in a constant and unceasing search for the meaning of medieval architecture. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tomasz, for a kind of wonderful overview of those buildings that so captivated Paul. We have a fair bit of time now for any discussion or questions, or indeed pick up on any of the points raised yesterday. So Zoe, I'm going to invite you, as it were, back to the Zoom floor and invite anyone to put questions that they might have in the chat. But I might begin, if I may, just with the question for you, Zoe, which is just, I mean, about this kind of, this wonderful image that you paint of the kind of geography of Gothic art and architecture expanding, at least for a kind of English-speaking audience, following, you know, Paul and others. And you talked about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I wondered, well, first, I mean, this is sort of really out of kind of idle curiosity, but did Paul recruit students directly from Central Europe and Eastern Europe? I mean, I know that, you know, people like, you know, there were a number of his students who had their origins there, but did they come, was Klára or Tomáš or other people, were they pushing them to study in London with Paul, or was that kind of chance? And did the, you know, did the expansion of the EU in 2004, for instance, did that make a big difference in terms of students for Paul, do you think, or maybe that was too late?
I mean, I think that these, you know, Paul is a very extraordinary person, but I think he also lived in very extraordinary times, and that is definitely reflected on the path he was able to take. I mean, obviously going to Poland in the 70s was extremely difficult and brave. I think things changed greatly in the 90s. Now, I would say that in terms of East and Central European students coming over, of course, the names I listed, and there were many more MA students and so on, some of them came to the Courtauld specifically to study with Paul because they knew his reputation. I think for a Czech student to come, say, or Polish, to come and study in London, the costs were very prohibitive. So I think that perhaps slightly limited the number of people generally coming out of these, you know, countries beyond the Iron Curtain following the fall of the Berlin Wall. As for European Union, well, I mean, you know, I can't remember the time before personally, but we're obviously experiencing very different times now, and we'll see what happens to our European students in the future. But that's a slightly perhaps sad topic to open now. But I remember the Courtauld as being extremely cosmopolitan, and in terms of what it taught, I mean, I'm talking specifically about the medieval period and the kind of students one could meet, the languages spoken, which meant that the exchanges between us were really, really very kind of rich and interesting. And the trips, I mean, I didn't want to go into that because we are yet to come to that this afternoon. This is going to be probably the most, you know, engaging of all lectures today, what we're going to see from Lindy and Jeffrey. But yes, that was also another venue where people could actually meet, and sometimes from entirely different institutions. So all these things work beautifully, like sunset, in harmony.
Thank you. It nearly make me weep to think about that kind of cosmopolitanism. Let's hope it can be sustained. And in fact, Alex Bovey has a kind of a related question for both speakers, really, which is about if you have thoughts on how we can kind of build on that internationalist frontier crossing tradition into the future.
Yeah, I don't know. Tomek, help me.
I don't know too.
Yes, I mean, I think we are, individually through our, connections that we've built. I think the student issue is going to be a separate one, but I think we all are. We are very international, and I'm sure that will continue. I mean, in the Middle Ages, it's impossible to study them and limit them to any one territory or country. So, and quite how the funding will work and support our projects and our students. But I think also, of course, what was, incredible adventure in the 1970s and even early 1980s is now taken, well, no, perhaps not right now, but before, 2019 was taken as being a kind of, boarding a plane and going somewhere even for a day, it was a possibility. So travel became a lot more easy. Yeah.
Paul was a brave boy and hardworking, so he didn't afraid.
No, he took a challenge.
Well, Stephen Murray's got an interesting question, which is about the Courtauld trip to Poland in 1968, and he asks if Paul was on that. I don't know if either of you knows the answer to that, or indeed if Stephen, if you know anything else about that trip.
I don't know. He never told me about it. If I remember, first time he went to Krakow in 1969.
It's Stephen Murray here. I was on that trip, and it was extraordinary. It was a real eye-opener to see those glorious buildings, and the logistics of getting there were so hard that it made it that much more exciting. We were refused entry at the last moment because they were members of the group were Jewish. And to our credit, to the Courtauld Institute, the group fought against this and we were allowed in. And so the whole thing was hard. And I've been struggling to remember if Paul was part of it. I don't think he was. But I just wondered if there was other information which I don't have. But that would have been interesting as at the start of Paul's career to have that link.
And that was presumably led by George Janetsky, was it?
It was led by George Janetsky and Peter Kidson and Peter Lasko. And they all sat in the back of the bus with their whiskey flasks, we all had a rollicking good time during that trip, which, as I repeat, was just unforgettable. I've seen some of those churches and they are just overwhelming in their austerity and their beauty.
Thank you. I didn't know about that. Well, we do, somewhere in the Courtauld archives, there are the booklets that they made for those old summer trips, which show the extraordinary amount of work that went into them and the compilation of bibliographies, translations of texts and so on. I say this enviously because I never had a chance to go on one, but that is important material, I think. Thomas, a question for you. So you talked about Paul being brave in coming over to Poland, but was he in other fields, so outside of medieval art, were there other scholars coming from the UK or the US to Poland in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, or was Paul unusual even in the kind of a broader realm?
There were some exchange to Poland. If I remember, during my studies, I met some French, English students, but only for a short trip, not for scholarship or internship like Paul. Paul got an extra internship in '69. It was not forbidden, there was exchange during all communist time, maybe after after Stalin's death, late 50s and whole 60s. It was not unusual, but rather very rare. Especially in 70s, it was more common. During 70s we were more free, and the exchange was common. Exchange of literature started, so it was not unusual.
And initially, after the 1990s, there were lots of British academies that ran lots of exchange schemes with sort of sending, I benefited from that, sending scholars to Prague or to Poland, and then more importantly, really, Czech Polish scholars were coming here for a period of study, financially supported. That was a very good idea.
Thank you. Okay, well, I can't see any further questions in the chat. So if there are no further questions, then it falls to me to thank Zoe and Tomek again for two really wonderful papers. And we have a little bit of time now to take a break from screens and so on, but we will reconvene at 3:45, so 3:45 UK time, when we have two papers by Lindy Grant and Jeffrey Hamburger. So thank you very much again, and we will see you just before 3:45.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom, very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back from whatever you've been doing in the garden, watching tennis, checking your emails, and welcome to this, the penultimate session of the conference. I'm going to straight away introduce our first speaker in this session, who is Lindy Grant, who is Professor Emerita of History at the University of Reading and also an honorary research fellow at the Courtauld, where she was Conway librarian for a number of years, and prior to that a student of PK's. I've already had a sneak preview of her talk, and I can tell you that it looks lots of fun. There's some quite amusing photos in there, but also, to borrow a phrase, that it will be absolutely fascinating. So in a slight adjustment to her advertised title, Lindy's paper today is on Photography, Modernity and the Architectural Historian, a view from the Conway Library. So over to you, Lindy.
Right, thank you very much. Is that sharing?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, right. Thank you very much indeed, Tom, for that introduction. I was very touched to be asked to speak by Tom at this event to remember both PK and Paul Crossley. Before I begin, I'd like to thank various people for their help. Tom Bilson in the Conway Library and Robin Viner-Armitage of the Courtauld Library, Dr. Paul Taylor at the Warburg Photo Library, and Professor Jacqueline Jung of Yale University, who very kindly sent me a copy of her wonderful recent article, The Work of Gothic Sculpture in the Age of Photographic Reproduction. I first met PK when I was interviewed for a place on the MA course at the Courtauld Institute in 1974. The other interviewers were Alan Bowness and Michael Hurst. I thought discussion with Michael Hurst was going okay when PK suddenly interjected, "You don't think about art, do you? You just feel about it." Even worse, at the end of the interview, when Alan Bowness asked PK if he would like to ask me anything, PK replied, "I don't think there would be any point." It was not going well. PK had form in interviews. A few years later, he asked a nice American woman called Madeline Jacket, "Well, Mrs. Jacket, you seem to know very little about quite a lot of subjects. Is there any one subject about which you know anything much?" Anyway, I was offered a place on the MA and much enjoyed it, and then started working in the Conway and started doing my doctorate with PK on Gothic architecture in Normandy. I think I was probably the last student that I was the last student he tried to get interested in that subject. I think Paul had been one of the first of them, and everyone had been put off by Rouen Cathedral. I can't remember when I first met Paul, but it was probably at one of the British Archaeological Association conferences in the late 1970s. He was my external examiner for the doctorate. And I do remember that at one point, Paul and PK had an extended argument about Arras Cathedral, and I just sat back and let them get on with it. Paul was a great support when he came to the Courtauld Institute, and I was really touched because he read my book on Abbot Sujet before I sent it off to the publishers, and that was, I was so grateful for that. The theme of the conference in their honour is the history of art. One of the most important tools for historians of the buildings of the past and of the embellishments, the stained glass and the sculpture and the furnishings that made those buildings live is photography. Photography was a new modern medium in the mid-19th century, and architecture was an important subject from the start, not least because buildings stood still, a real advantage with long exposure times. Moreover, the invention of photography coincided with a new fascination with the medieval past and a new appreciation of its monuments and the need to conserve them. The architect restorer Viollet-le-Duc, for instance, actively encouraged photographers to document his major restoration project. And here is a photograph showing his restoration of Notre Dame. I'd said taken in the mid-1860s, sorry, it's the late 1850s. I realized rechecking Notre Dame. Photographs of great monuments were made and collected to understand and celebrate the past of the nation state and to create the canon of great national monuments. And the most famous and one of the earliest of these attempts was the Mission Héliographique, established in 1851 by Prosper Mérimée when he was head of the Monument Historique in France, when he sent out a whole set of photographers to capture images of the great monuments of France. And this is one of Edouard Baldus's photographs, a salt paper print of the west front of Chartres Cathedral. Photography captured the monument as an object of wonder. I'm going to call it the evocative photograph. Here is Wells Cathedral from the early 1850s. I think it's probably a Roger Fenton, if not Francis Bedford. Many photographers evoked the monument as exotic and other, as in this photograph, which is definitely by Francis Bedford, taken when he accompanied the Prince of Wales on his trip to the Holy Land in 1862. These evocative photographs were aimed at real or virtual tourists, and they were very expensive to buy. Tourist photography was transformed with the invention of roll film and small portable cameras around 1890, which meant that tourist photography could become the preserve of the amateur. And here's a classic example, this photograph of Long Cathedral by Dr. Rothsay Stewart, which was taken around 1905. Rothsay Stewart was a physician rather than an academic historian. But from the start, there was certainly some use of the photograph as documentation, as an intellectual tool for the understanding of past monuments. An outstanding example was the campaign to document the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, undertaken in 1866 by Charles Thurston Thompson at the behest of the South Kensington Museum, where he was the official photographer, to provide context for the cast of the Portico de la Gloria, which the South Kensington Museum had just commissioned. Among those collecting photographs to understand the buildings of the past was Martin Conway, later Lord Conway of Allington, 1856 to 1937. Conway had begun collecting photographs of architecture, sculpture, and medieval painting by the mid-1880s. Conway discovered art history as a scientific academic discipline during the time he spent at German universities in his student days. He remained throughout his life conscious of how seriously the study was taken within German universities, unlike Britain, where the study of the material culture of the past was the province of antiquarians. Conway supported the foundation of the Courtauld Institute as the first university institution in Britain devoted to the study of the history of art in 1932, and bequeathed his collection of photographs to it. In this talk, I'm going to explore aspects of the expansion of the Conway Library in the post-war period under the leadership of George Janetsky and PK. George was a mentor to both PK and Paul Crossley. PK worked with George in the Conway Library before succeeding him as Conway librarian. When Paul decided to do his research with PK on Polish Gothic architecture, it was George who made the key phone calls which opened doors for Paul in Poland. Those who attended the Courtauld Summer School in Western France in 1981 might remember the brilliantly funny, deeply affectionate double act of Jonathan Alexander as George and PK and Paul as PK, which reduced all who heard it to helpless laughter. And here's a photograph of George and PK in the back of the bus, as referred to by Stephen Murray in the last session. In his obituary of George for the Burlington magazine, PK stressed George's background in Middle European, German-influenced intellectual traditions in art history. George owed his position in the Conway Library at the Courtauld to Anthony Blunt. Blunt's own intellectual connections were with German or Viennese art historians, large numbers of whom had arrived in Britain as refugees from Nazi Germany and occupied Europe. Many refugee art historians were attached to or associated with the Warwick Institute, which came to London in 1933. Their approach, as PK noted, was modernist, the antithesis of British antiquarianism. PK developed this into a discussion of the different strains of art history represented by, on the one hand, George's and Blunt's Middle European intellectual modernism, and on the other hand, Christopher Holler's, which PK characterized as that of the Oxford History School, not antiquarianism. In this paper, I want to trace the impact of Germanic modernist tradition in another area, in photography within the Conway Library. As I have said, Lord Conway himself had been inspired by the scientific modernist Germanic approach to the history of art to create his great comparative tool, his visual compendium. If anything, he was rather ahead of the game. The Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence had a photographic library from its inception in 1897. In 1913, Richard Hamann set up his research institute for the study of art at the University of Marburg with, right from the start, a photograph archive which would become the Bildarchiv Photo Marburg. During the Second World War, Hamann and his son, Richard Hamann MacLean, led a series of documentary photographic campaigns fully supported by the Third Reich, famously, for instance, here at Reims Cathedral, as here, and at Chartres Cathedral. And when Abbey Warburg founded his institute at Hamburg in 1926, a photo library was as fundamental to his conception as a book library. All these collections saw photography as a model of the Neue Sachlichkeit, the new objectivity, and as a modernist objective tool to document and thus comprehend the history of art and architecture. In that, these photo libraries were different in conception and intention from the collection of photographs instituted by Mérimée for the Monument Historique in Paris, which aimed to record and establish a canon of the monuments of the nation and to act as an archive of guidance and record for those who restored or conserved them. The National Building Record, later the National Monument Record, set up in 1940 with the English material from the Conway Library, had in effect the same rationale as the Monument Historique. And indeed, the Marburg archive came to incorporate this nationalist and canon-forming approach when it began to inventory German monuments in the 1930s. George Tenetsky was himself a highly effective photographer, usually using 35mm film, but also quarter plate and occasionally half plate cameras. He worked closely with colleagues at the Warburg Institute, especially C. Reg Dodwell, who was based in the Warburg Photo Library between 1949 and 1953. In 1951, George, Reg Dodwell and Peter Lasko, who had just graduated from the Courtauld, went on a famous tour of Europe photographing medieval monuments, inaugurating the famous series of Conway trips. Would you buy a used car from any of these three? Famously, when they arrived at Saint-Omer, they shared a room with one bed in it. I think that was all that was available. Peter Lasko leapt into the middle and snored his way through the night, and George and Reg Dodwell clung to the sides either side of him. The Conway and the Warburg photo libraries even had a boat race on the Serpentine, but history does not relate to one. George also set up, in the fashion of the German photo libraries, a photographic studio to print and take photographs. The first head of it was German, Ursula Pariser, 1917 to 2010, and I think that might be her there, if you can see my cursor in the middle of this photograph. I remember PK telling me that Ursula Pariser was Bauhaus trained. That was not quite right. Instead, she was trained at the Ryman School in London between 1937 and 1940. The Ryman School was a prestigious private college set up in Berlin in the 1920s to provide technical training in design, printing, typography, communication, and photography. It was quintessentially modernist in ethos and approach, and had close contacts with the Bauhaus, with some sharing of staff. In 1937, for the usual reasons, they set up the London School, and that was where Ursula Pariser, who had also come to London, was trained. Training in photography at the London Ryman School was delivered by Walter Nürnberg, who is widely regarded as the inventor of industrial photography. I think one can see his influence in the strong lighting and the powerful tonal range of Ursula Pariser's photographs. Although the London Ryman School did not survive the war, staff and students from it were closely involved in design at the BBC and at the Festival of Britain in 1951, so with very strong modernist projects. Unlike George, PK did not often take photographs himself, and nor did Paul very often. When he did, his photographs weren't terribly good, though several of PK's and George's students turned themselves into highly effective photographers, above all Christopher Wilson. Instead, PK worked with the photographers from the photographic department. In 1958, Piquet published his brilliant short book, Sculpture at Chartres, with photographs by Ursula Parisa. And one might note that Ursula Parisa gets full double billing with Piquet on the title page. The photographs were taken during a campaign in France in 1956. And note that Ursula Parisa was clearly using scaffolding to take these photographs. I don't know how they managed that. I imagine Anthony Blunt was possibly able to call in some favors there. During this campaign, this French campaign in 1956, it focused on Chartres, but they also photographed at Étampes and Ivry-la-Bataille, and also Philibert Delorme's chateau at Annay for Anthony Blunt. And I think this photograph probably shows them having lunch on that particular trip. Ursula Parisa was a formidable photographer, but perhaps not the easiest colleague. At all events, I remember Piquet saying that working with her on Chartres was enough to drive one to drink. Over the years, Piquet developed a close and effective working relationship with Janet Barnforth, who was one of Miss Parisa's successors. This slide shows Piquet, I think, just checking the sight lines of a camera set up by one of the photographic department at Swindon. I think that Janet's photos, and here are two by her, have some of that strong tonal range that must derive from the Ryman school training provided by Walter Nürnberg. And at her best, working with Piquet, Janet produced some of the best documentary architectural photographs I know. Piquet said that the one of Long here was taken on an occasion when they were driving back from somewhere else and suddenly saw the sun on the west front of Long against a sort of dark sky. And Piquet said to Janet, just stop the van, get out of it and take that photograph, which she did. It's a great photo. In 1965, Ursula Parisa left for Dumbarton Oaks in America, and she was succeeded as head of the photographic department by Brigitte Klebender. And here's Mrs. Klebender here. Mrs. Klebender, too, was a German émigré. I don't know whether she trained in Germany or, like Ursula Parisa, in London at the Ryman School. Recent research is beginning to explore the strikingly large number of women photographers trained in Germany in the 1930s. Many of them were of Jewish extraction and, like presumably Ursula Parisa and Brigitte Klebender, had to emigrate. A recent exhibition, Another Eye, Women Refugee Photographers in Britain After 1933, at the Four Corners Gallery last year in 2020, presented the work of many of these women and stressed the extent to which photography was seen as modern, technical, scientific, and as an exciting career path for women in interwar Germany. Among the women photographers featured in the exhibition was Heidi Hyman, who medievalists would know for her brilliant iconographic analyses of, for instance, the capitals at Chartres Cathedral. But Heidi Hyman, having done her doctorate with Panofsky and then worked for Panofsky as an assistant for no money, retrained as a photographer at the Letter Association College in Berlin in 1935. After she came to England in 1937, she worked as a photojournalist with the Picture Post and found a niche post-war in the photo library at the Warburg Institute. And here one of her photographs of Chartres Cathedral. I think she might be the woman with the jauntily angled hat in the Warburg boat with Dodwell at the boat race on the Serpentine. In 1963, Heidi Hyman, George Janetsky, and Ursula Parisa, with presumably Peter Kidson, teamed up to produce a Courtauld Warburg exhibition on sculpture at Chartres, featuring the photographs of both women. Another important German woman architectural photographer was Hilda Lotzbauer, who was based at the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence and the Bibliotheca Hertziana in Rome. She was not Jewish and had no need to emigrate. Indeed, during the Second World War, like Hamann and his Marburg team, she photographed Italian monuments under the aegis of the German state. In 1980, the Conway Library hosted an exhibition of her evocative and often disquietingly empty photographs of wartime Florence. I have stressed the importance of the German scientific, modernist, new objectivist approach to the photograph as documentary record in the post-war Conway under George Janetsky's and then PK's leadership. Of course, that is to simply oversimplify. The wartime Marburg photographic campaigns produced documentary images of superb technical accomplishment with every appearance of new objectivity, but the campaigns were, of course, very political, anything but objective. Hilda Lotzbauer's work has been seen as, quote, not just documentary in approach. Her evocative photographs of buildings, often with carefully placed people, seem to be in the tradition of 19th century photographs, the evocative photograph of the monument, and indeed almost the traditions of the exotic and the other. They have much in common with tourist photography, the work of amateur photographers, usually men, who were wealthy enough to travel widely and able to take advantage of the new roll film cameras aimed at the amateur market developed in the 1890s. The results were often highly attractive photographs, and they were often by cultured amateurs richly informed about great monuments. The Conway Library, both before the war and under George's and PK's new dispensation, was much enriched by these tourist photographs. And I'd include here Robert Byron under this heading, and here's one of his photographs of Danzig in 1937, and the wonderful photographs of the well-travelled Leicester physician, Dr. Rothsay Stewart. And British photography had its own tradition of documenting monuments, not least that established by Charles Thurston Thompson and the South Kensington Museum, and carried on into the 20th century. And here are two great practitioners of that tradition. F.H. Crossley, no relation of Paul's, was an expert in medieval woodwork. Here's one of his photographs of Chester Cathedral. Arthur Gardner pioneered the study of medieval sculpture in Britain in the early 20th century. Both were impressive documentary photographers, and their collections, the collections of their images, were important additions to the Conway. Much work remains to be done on British photographers of the first half of the 20th century to disentangle these intellectual strands of evocative, tourist, antiquarian, and documentary photography. I want to finish with a word on teaching with photographs. George, PK, and Paul all revelled in the richness of the Conway as a resource for teaching. Using slides is very important, of course, but teaching with slides is safe, controlled, very good for providing answers. Using a whole load of Conway photographs was to live dangerously, to surrender control, to accept that there might be more questions than answers. Although neither PK nor Paul photographed much themselves, nevertheless, for both of them, photographs provided a way to comprehend the great buildings of the Middle Ages, and provided the tools with which one might know, if not the mind of God, then perhaps the mind of William of Sens, or Peter Parler, or even that famously unreliable witness, Abbot Sujet of Saint-Denis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindy. That really didn't disappoint. That was really absolutely fascinating. Such extraordinary rich material, so important for the development of the field in the 20th century. So thank you very much for that. I hope we can have a discussion, a good discussion about that. But we turn first to our last paper in this session, which is from Jeffrey Hamburger, who's the Kuno Franke Professor of German Art and Culture at Harvard University. And in the early 2000s, he and Paul embarked on a series of absolutely sort of epic and memorable trips. I only went on one of them, but it was certainly very memorable, through Germany and England with students from Harvard and the Courtauld. And today, Jeffrey will remember Paul on the road.
Thank you very much. And before I start, I just want to check that you can all see my screen.
Yes, we can. Perfect. Thank you.
Terrific. And I should also say that in comparison to the many splendid papers we've heard thus far, mine, and I take a certain perverse pleasure in saying this, has no scholarly pretensions whatsoever. However, I hope that it can still serve some useful purpose in the context of this little symposium. Now that our dear friend and colleague Paul has taken his final journey, it is bittersweet, to say the least, to think back on the many trips we took together over the course of a memorable decade, whether in the company of family and friends, or more often, our students. We've heard a great deal these past 2 days about Paul and PK as scholars. I studied with the latter when I was briefly a student at the Courtauld in 1979, 1980. I'll never forget him poring over photographs in the Conway Library with his calipers. But I wish to speak, and very informally at that, about Paul as a teacher. Had I addressed his scholarship, I would perhaps have dwelt on his mastery of historiography, a perspective that always informed his architectural analysis and that proved particularly important when dealing with Central European architecture in the wake of National Socialism, which turned nearly every site from the German-speaking world into a veritable minefield. Today, however, my focus is personal, even anecdotal, as such memories also form part of what needs to be remembered. I hope to do so through some of the excursions we took together, also to highlight the immense value of such expeditions as a pedagogical practice. They are also a good way to cement friendships that last a lifetime. These trips placed Paul in his element, which was talking to students on site about buildings that he loved, sharing with them his immense knowledge, which he always wore very lightly, his irrepressible enthusiasm, which knew no limits, and most of all, his ability to see with searching intelligence and to translate those perceptions into wonderfully cogent prose. My first excursion with Paul predates those he undertook with me during my time as a professor of art and architecture at Harvard University. Some of you may remember it. It took place in prehistoric times at the end of what was probably one of the most turbulent years in the Courtauld's history, the academic year 79-80, during which the entire Blunt affair unfolded, and during which I attended his last series of lectures, as I recall, on Bernini and Borromini. As a freshly minted BA on a Fulbright fellowship, I had the status of what then, and perhaps still now, was called an occasional student, a title I took very seriously, but that officially referred to those enrollees who were not aiming to receive a terminal MA. At that time, Paul was all of 35 years old, a senior scholar in my eyes, and still at Manchester University. Along with a crew of worthies, among them Jonathan Alexander, then his colleague, Ellen Borg, Lindsay Grant, Anat Cherikover, Deborah Kahn, incidentally now a neighbor of mine in Boston, Roger Stalley, who I'll never forget, took me off to see Saint-Serge in Angers when everyone else had retired to a patisserie, Paul, and of course, PK, whoops, sorry, slide, there's Saint-Serge, and there's PK, who on our trip held court, as has been mentioned, at the back of the bus, where a case of wine fit comfortably between the seats. We were led by George Jarnetsky from Chartres all the way to the Pyrenees, principally through Poitou, Périgord, and the Dordogne, along an itinerary that took in many of the greatest monasteries and cathedrals of Western France. And let me just say, if you happen to be among the audience and don't like your photograph or are offended that I left you out, I have to say that for a group of art historians, Courtauld medievalists appeared to be remarkably camera shy. The slick Solis Novotels in which we stayed along the way, I think of them as the McDonald's of the hospitality industry, provided a stark contrast to the beautiful buildings that filled our days. At least the stiff triangular cushions on the beds provided a marvelous means of demonstrating the ways in which voussoir blocks cohered so as to form stable arches. The other guests who had to pass through our constructions and the hotel's hallways, however, were less amused, especially when, suffering the same fate as William of Sens, they had the entire edifice collapsed on their heads. In the evenings, Paul participated in furious ping pong tournaments, an arena in which students for once were able to best their professors. For me as a starting student, what left the most lasting impression, along with the sites themselves, was the way in which the trip modeled an ideal intellectual community in terms of friendship and shared enthusiasm, strangely different, I couldn't help but notice, from stiffer interactions in the classroom. The entire trip began in Chartres, which we were given no more than about half an hour to see, circumstances which inevitably reminded me of the classic column, The 4-Minute Louvre, by the American humorist Art Buchwald. And if you haven't read it, I recommend it highly. In an act of extraordinary largesse, the trip was financed in its entirety by Mrs. Barbara Robertson of Robertson's Jams and Jellies, who for 25 years, beginning in 1956, sponsored such excursions, in each case led by a member of the faculty who chose the itinerary. Little did I know at the time that our trip was the penultimate in the entire series. I was very lucky indeed. Mrs. Robertson made a lasting impression, not so much on account of her company's logo, which we already then considered scandalous, than because of her whistle, which she would blow vociferously 5 minutes prior to departure. Woe betide anyone who was late. In fact, we lost 2 fellow travelers already in Chartres. I don't recall if they ever caught up with us. A little bit like that famous passage in Voltaire's Candide, when the young ingénu, having asked why Admiral John Byng, following his defeat by the French in 1757, was denied a pardon by George II and shot as a scapegoat, is told, "Pour encourager les autres." We lost no further members of our party. Among the highlights of the trip, Aulnay, the site of an especially memorable picnic, Parthenay, of which some of the best bits are now found not in France, but rather in Boston's Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Mel, Chahoud, with its spectacular tower, built in part to house its famous relic of Christ's foreskin. Souillac and Moissac, all in sun so hot it felt like a pile driver. In Cahors, we almost all jumped off into the river by the medieval bridge. I remember vividly Paul and PK running excitedly around the exterior of Saint-Savin-sur-Gartempe to discuss some feature of the apse. Perhaps most instructive, however, was a moment in the lapidarium of Saintes, where Professor Żarnecki had a staff member from the Conway who accompanied us take some images. As we gathered round, the photographer, who was setting up his lights, called out, tongue-in-cheek, "Hey, George, what date do you want it to be?" With that, I learned all one needed to know about photography and connoisseurship. Flash forward to the more recent past. Prague, 2006, sometime between July 7th and 12th. In the context of the great exhibition to which Zoe referred, organized to accompany Prague, the Crown of Bohemia, which opened at the Metropolitan Museum in New York in 2005, then in fuller fashion in Prague, Paul, Robert Sukale, since also sadly passed away, Zoe Opačić and I, accompanied by Jerzy Veit, were treated to a tour of the cathedral's upper stories so as to be able to see the triforium and its famous gallery of busts, Peter Parlor among them, that remain more or less invisible from ground level. As we made the rounds, I suggested that we should not deny our students the same pleasure, and with that, our collaboration was born. Among other participants on these trips were Joanna Cannon, John Loudon, and Andreas Puth. And so to Prague we returned. This photo was taken, I think, after a few too many years. I'm not sure what in this photograph I was seeking to draw Paul's attention to. As always, however, Paul had a way of seeing things that the rest of us did not notice. Other trips ensued to Franconia, Bavaria, Saxony, as well as to the cathedrals of England, from Canterbury to Durham, with many stops in between. At a certain point, it dawned on us that we could also take trips without students. The first fruit of this realization was an odyssey along the Baltic coast to visit highlights of Bachstein Gothic, beginning in Hamburg and ending in Stargard in Poland. Unfortunately, we never made it as far as Gdansk and Marienburg. Highlights of this trip included the Cistercian monastery of Bad Dobran, as remarkable for its extraordinarily well-preserved furnishings as for its architecture, the well-preserved walls and gates, not to mention the church in Neubrandenburg, the ruined Cistercian Abbey at Cohen, north of Berlin, where Paul vainly tried to convince my younger daughter to become an architectural historian. Like everyone else, however, she was so taken with Paul that when she first met him on the occasion of a dinner held at my home when he lectured at Harvard, she sneaked into the kitchen between courses and asked me, "Can we keep him?" We became so accustomed to poring over guidebooks together, pointing out unexpected details of the architecture, and generally gushing over all the sites, that by the end of the trip in Szczecin, we posed for these entirely fictitious pictures, taken, I think, outside a parking lot or another such monument. On another such occasion, we crisscrossed Swabia in the company of Peter Ruckert, the archivist in Stuttgart, seen here showing us a remarkably well-preserved instance of the Golden Bull of Charles IV. Stops along the way included the monastery of Blaubeuren, where we crashed an event in the cloister, Dinkelsbühl, where in addition to admiring the well-preserved city walls and churches, we had time to smell the proverbial roses. Malbronn, an astonishing place, where the fountain in the cloister provided welcome relief in record-breaking heat. Neresheim, Balthasar Neumann's late masterpiece, and reference was made earlier to Paul's love of German Baroque architecture, a spot that stood out on account of some particularly fine Maultaschen. I think that's Paul looking at the menu. Schwäbisch Gmünd and Ulm atop the Münster on a brutally hot day. That seems to be a leitmotif. It almost killed us, or at least me. Throughout our travels, Paul proved an able photographic assistant. We were planning another such trip to the Balkans when, unfortunately, Paul's declining health forced us to postpone and then cancel our plans. When I described such trips to friends and family, they would often roll their eyes and say, "Research. Some of my students who thought that they were going to be treated to a paid vacation ended up feeling that our forays were more akin to a forced march. So little time, so much to see. To see Robert Zuccale here in Bamberg, a city he knew like the back of his hand, charging ahead with 2 canes, 1 in each hand, as students lagged behind, was an inspiration. Here we are on the porch of the Obere Pfarrhaus and at the Adamsportal of the cathedral. No detail was too small to be overlooked. Of course, after a strenuous day, there was no alternative to ice cream. This said, there is probably nothing more tedious than being made to look at photos from other people's summer vacations. So to the extent that this little presentation resembles such an occasion, I promise to cut it short. Just a few memories, for example, from our trip to England. Canterbury marked our point of departure. Paul waxed eloquent. We saw many astonishing sights beyond the purview of the usual visitor. The most astonishing, perhaps, being the extent to which we emerged from our tour covered with dirt and dust, not to mention pigeon droppings, only to notice that Brigadier Murden, the cathedral's receiver general, impeccably dressed in a suit and tie and spit-polished shoes, emerged every bit as crisp and clean as when we went in. In Cambridge, in addition to visiting King's College, we were treated by Christopher de Hemel to some of the greatest treasures of Corpus Christi. In Durham, having fought for the privilege of showing ourselves around the cathedral, no less in the Middle Ages, a generous donation proved very persuasive, we gained entrance to the all-important gallery so as to view one of the birthplaces of Gothic vaulting. You'll never imagine what we are here holding in our hands. Any guesses? These little bits of wood are nothing other than fragments of the coffin of St. Cuthbert, genuine contact relics passed out with a casual abandon that astonished me. I afterwards instructed my students not to wash their hands. At Lincoln, Paul saw Purbeck marble for the first time. We also held chapter. Here at Bingham Priory, Choirmaster Crossley conducting his choristers. And here, like Moses and the Israelites at Swatham, Paul leading his people to salvation. Although it has to be said that the one thing one couldn't do was rely on Paul for directions. There was more than one occasion on which we had to send out search parties, always with success, I might add, if not always without anxiety. The camaraderie and shared insights that such trips afforded were really priceless, certainly for American students who can't take the study of medieval monuments in situ for granted. I always wished that our textbooks about Gothic architecture contained not only plans, elevations, sections, and a selection of representative views, but also pictures of the guts of the building, medieval, or here at Chartres, modern. And the modern roof at Chartres, I think, is all the more interesting in comparison to the so-called forest at Notre Dame in Paris, much discussed since the fire of 2019. Once you have climbed a cathedral, it's much harder to think of these buildings as material manifestations of ideas. It also gives one an entirely different perspective on recent restoration controversies. Today's students have access via websites such as Stephen Murray's exemplary Mapping Gothic France, but there is, no need to tell this audience, no substitute for the real thing. As many of you know better than I, Paul was an inspired teacher. His lectures outside the classroom were carefully scripted performances, the buildings his stage sets. Beforehand, he would pull some crumpled notes from one pocket or another, or rummage through his bag in search of his notebook. But when the time came to confront the building, nothing stood between him and his audience. His presentations were systematic yet inspired. Students stood, or sat, in rapt attention, as did we. The last thing I want to do is wallow in nostalgia. As we begin to emerge from the COVID pandemic, I am sure that we all feel the pent-up desire to see old friends and to visit medieval monuments. The best part of these excursions is that they allowed us to do both at the same time. With the benefit of hindsight, my only wish is that I'd taken fewer photographs of buildings and more of people, Paul among them. May there in future be many more such occasions. Paul will always be with us in spirit. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. So many happy memories and some wonderful photos in there, and some Lindy too. So, gosh, we have a bit of time now for any kind of discussion or questions. Lindy, I might invite you to return, as it were, to put your video on. I'm encourage anyone to put questions in the chat here, but I might begin with one question. So I never went on any of those Robertson trips, but obviously they were funded by JAM. But how was the Conway funded, Lindy? I mean, it must have been an expensive operation. Did it just come out of kind of magical Courtauld funds, or was there a particular source?
Sorry, I lost you suddenly at the end. How was the Conway funded? Well, I mean, it was from central funding. I mean, it's Debbie who can probably tell you about that. And of course, the funding was always a bit iffy. On the Robertson funded summer schools, there was usually a place for someone from the Conway to go and take photographs on it, so particularly that was true on the earlier ones to well, I mean, they went to Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean, all sorts of exciting places, Turkey, Eastern Turkey, etc. But yeah, funding, I mean, for Conway trips, when I was in the Conway, I mean, sometimes funding came from private sources and things like that. I mean, I think, you know, it was always a fight to produce that funding for, you know, valuable photographs, and they didn't cost very much. I did my first Conway trip in, wait a minute, 1979, and I had to get 4 of us round France for 4 weeks, and I had a budget of £1,000, and that what I just did it. It was eye-wateringly tight, eye-wateringly tight. But the Robertson's trip, she just Mrs. Robertson funded them, I think, from her own resources, and she started them, I think, with Anthony Blunt, and I think they started just going to Bath and then went, you know, more widely.
Thank you, Lindy. I've turned off my video because I think my audio might be a bit dodgy, so I hope everyone can hear me.
It is slightly dodgy, yes.
Well, Jeffrey has a question, I think.
Lindy, thank you for your presentation. I remember from my year at the Courtauld that I spent untold hours pouring through photographs and even made some discoveries there that I later published. But my question has to do with the early history of architectural photography and Notre Dame in particular. I taught a course on Notre Dame in light of the fire this past year, and I was pleased to find the Courtauld's online exhibition of early photography. But I was wondering, given that those photographs more or less coincide with those early photographs more or less coincide with the invention of the photography as a medium, my sense from the very little research I was able to do is that there's been remarkably little written about that body of photography as the point of origin for the whole tradition of architectural photography. Am I wrong in that impression?
Well, I have to say that before I left the Conway, which was in 2006, I had really started doing quite a lot of work on the history of architectural photography. At that stage, very little had been done. Much more has been done in the last decade and a half, which I haven't been able to keep up. I'm just, getting up to speed with it now. But you're absolutely right. There's less than one might think on architectural photography, on photography of the monuments. The great work on the Mission Héliographique is by Anne de Mondenard, and that wonderful book, and she has looked at those photographs taken in that context. But I think there's still a huge amount to be done thinking about photography of monuments. And people have been very interested in, I suppose, Orientalism and the photographs. So a lot of interest in the very large number of photographs that were taken of monuments in the Middle East, in India. But there's less work on the photographers of the great monuments of.
And if I could quickly follow up, in your marvelous overview, you made no mention of North American figures, and I think not only of Arthur Kingsley Porter, but with regard to Gothic, Clarence Ward. I used to teach at Oberlin College, and I have some amazing photographs by Clarence Ward, which the college foolishly, they threw away all of the original prints, which was scandalous. And as I'm sure most of you know, his photographic archive is now at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and it provided almost all the plates for Jean Bonny's epic book on French Gothic architecture. And I'm just curious how taking those North American figures into account would in any way alter or the account that you gave, or what was the nature of the interaction between the two different schools, if I can put it that way.
That's very interesting. I mean, one could have put in an awful lot more. I have thought about Arthur Kingsley Porter in the past, but didn't have time to think more about him for this particular paper. I think he knew Lord Conway, and I just think there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done about all of these photographers, and some of them, as I say, were really just grand tourists. Some of them were pretty serious, do we call them antiquarians, people who really knew an awful lot about the history of architecture or sculpture. And obviously Arthur Kingsley Porter just knowing so much. What I can't remember, was Kingsley Porter, he was attached to a university, was he?
First Yale and then Harvard.
Okay, yeah, I suddenly mentally blanked on that. Yeah. So that, what should one say, professional antiquarians there.
Thank you.
I'm going to try reading. Please tell me if the audio is bad, and then Alex Bovey might take over if there's a problem.
No, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. So in fact, I have a question from Alex, who says, Lindy, I'm curious about Paul's career as a photographer. Thomas showed a very unusual image of Paul as a student with cameras. I can't recall him having a camera or taking a photograph. He was a bit of a technophobe and almost a brace of notes that he asked him to consult. But do you know why he didn't take his own photos?
Right. Well, I tried looking for photographs in the Conway last week. It's not very easy working there at the moment, but I got in there. Photographs by Paul and Piquet. My impression was that neither of them had taken photographs at all. I did manage to find a couple of photographs by Piquet of Chartres, which must have been taken on this great photographic trip. And I found a handful of photographs by Paul of Poland, they weren't terribly good. I was going to put one in, and then I just decided I had quite a lot to say, and didn't put it into the. But there were very few of them, and I thought that was interesting. That's why I said, you know, they both used photographs for teaching, and they both really reveled in the huge number of photographs that you could use for teaching. But neither were photographers were photographers themselves to a great extent. But as I say, PK just had the resources of the Conway to use, and the resources of Conway photographers in a way. I mean, so he took his photographs, had photographs taken for him, you know, under his direction.
Thank you. So another question here for Lindy. Could you shed some light on the origins of the National Monuments Record and how it finished up in Swindon as part of the Royal Commission on Historic Monuments, England?
Right, okay. Sarah Pearson can probably tell you much more about that than I can. It was founded during the Second World War. The Courtauld Institute was still quite young. They had got Lord Conway's photographs shortly before his death in 1937. And then in 1940, I think it was felt that because so many buildings were in danger of being bombed, you know, there was suddenly a feeling that we needed, that Britain needed an inventorying of its great monuments. And here, I don't know whether Betsy Sears has some thoughts about this, or but I think that I suppose, you know, people like Pevsner were very aware of the inventorying of German monuments that had gone on at Photo Marburg, and the inventories almost produced by the Dehio books. And I think it's with that background, if you like, that people thought that they needed to set up the National Monument Record here. So the Conway British photographs were all sort of sent off there. And then towards in 1947, you can see the non-British material that they'd got coming back into the Conway. But from then on, the the National Monument Record was set up separately. It was run in London by the Royal Commission, which again Sarah can talk about much more than I can, and then was moved out to Swindon when they moved to Swindon in, goodness me, 1990s possibly. Does that help?
Thanks, Lindy. And I should just point out, if anyone's interested in this material, that there are plans next year for a series of seminars and lectures related to some of the questions that Lindy's been talking about, and also to the fact that the digitalization of the Conway Library is now virtually complete. So watch this space for more. But there's a question here, or a sort of comment and question from Betsy Sears, who notes that on the Andalusia trip, James Austin went along, who was also, of course, a fine photographer. And she asks if you know anything about how that connection came about.
Yes, James, I thought about mentioning James, but in a sense, because I was talking about modernism and really focusing on George and PK setting up the Conway Library after the Second World War. Yes, James, I think, did the MA in medieval studies at the Courtauld. So he studied with George, and he trained himself as a photographer, and really started by photographing Romanesque sculpture. and his photographs of Romanesque sculpture are lovely. His photographs have a very silvery quality, a very soft lighting, and in that they're very different. You can spot the difference between those and the traditions, if you like, I've identified as the Ryman School tradition, very strong photographs of the Courtauld, Courtauld photographic department. James set himself up as an entrepreneur to sell his photographs of Romanesque sculpture, and to start off he did very well, and then I think the postal strike absolutely put him out of business, and then he came and worked for the Courtauld Institute, and Constance Hill, who was Conway librarian, employed him. I have to say that there was quite a lot of rivalry between James, who was employed directly by the Conway, and the photographic department. James and Janet didn't get on terribly well. And I think the photographic department saw James was much more experimental. He used sort of different cameras. He used the Hasselblad rather than the big 5x4 cameras. And he also experimented with using plastic paper at a very early stage, and methods by which you could produce prints very, very fast. And I think the photographic department did feel a bit threatened by him. But I think perhaps the good thing was that they little bit of competition led to some very good photographs. James, I think, wonderful with sculpture. I still think that Janet, at her best, those photographs that she took with PK are very fine architectural photographs. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? This, well, and to some extent those photographs are used as teaching resources, as research resources, but thinking about them as works of art in their own right. You know, it's interesting that those discussions were sort of taking place, but maybe not amongst the same people as we're using them as teaching sources.
There was suddenly the stage when we realized that the Conway was stuffed with absolutely amazing, important 19th century photographs, which had been horribly abused because they'd been folded in half. I mean, I think I showed that one of the West Front of Wales. It's been, you know, folded in half to fit in a Conway box. And I remember getting Mark Hayworth Booth from the V&A to come along to have a look at what we'd got. And I said to him, "You'll be absolutely horrified at this." And he said, "No, that's true of every other collection of 19th century photographs. You know, for years, people just thought these were not very good photographs, and that modern photographs were so much better, and they have usually been abused. But of course, they're wonderful, wonderful things, the 19th century photographs. I'm afraid I love them."
Thank you. I might address a question to Geoffrey, which might be an impossible one to answer, but it's just about something that you alluded to, Geoffrey, about the way that students in the UK and in Europe are kind of spoilt when it comes to visiting medieval monuments. Whereas those in the US, you've got wonderful collections, of course, but in terms of seeing big buildings, it's much harder. And I just wondered, I mean, what we've seen in the last 2 days in some ways is the way that trips were so fundamental to the way that medieval architecture, medieval art and architecture was taught at the Courtauld in the 20th century. And I like to think still today, despite the events of the last year. I mean, do you think that those differences have had a kind of profound effect on the the kinds of materials people have taught and the ways particularly that they've approached them. That's for Geoffrey, but perhaps for anyone, I don't know if Lindy or anyone is able to, has thoughts on that.
I think it's far more a question for Geoffrey than for me, possibly, but.
Okay, well, we may have lost Geoffrey, I think. So I think that we will, that's maybe a good moment to pause, and then just a reminder that we have our final session starting at 5:30 with Stephen Murray. So now is a good moment to take a break from screens, and we will see you shortly. Hello and welcome back, everybody, for this our final session of the conference. Thank you for holding on, resisting the temptations of, well, many temptations that you may be facing. I'm going to introduce now our last speaker, who is Stephen Murray, who's the Lisa and Bernard Selt Professor Emeritus of Medieval Art History at Columbia University. Although he's lived and worked for many years in the US, Stephen studied for his PhD at the Courtauld under Peter Kidson. And I saw, as it happened, in a study published a few days ago, looking at the US dissertations index, that Stephen is recorded as the 7th most prolific supervisor of art history dissertations in the whole of the US over the last, whatever it is, 40 years or so that's been recorded, which gives us, I think, a kind of crude but telling index of his role in shaping the study of medieval architecture in the US, which of course is all the more impressive given the challenges of teaching distant monuments, as we've just discussed. So in this final paper, he offers us some historiographical reflections.
Greetings from New York. It's finally a little cooler here. Now, thank you, Tom, for persuading me to do this, because basically I don't do much in the way of conferences anymore. And Tom, when we started to chat, you suggested I present an overview of 20th century historiography of Gothic. And I thought that would be an incredible challenge. And basically, I would say it's been done already in this magnificent volume. Any student wanting to start out graduate work in Gothic architecture should just read the fabulous introduction that Paul Crossley wrote to the new edition of Paul Frankel that came out in 2000. And yet at the same time, Tom, your invitation to present an overview was so exciting that I took you literally. And so can you see my gallery of modern Goths here?
We certainly can.
And with apologies for those of you I have omitted. And for example, I've got Walter Leedy in the top left-hand corner by Marvin Trachtenberg. Dear Walter, a dear friend, was mentioned in this morning's session, worked a bit on Polish architecture. And there at the bottom right-hand side, you can see Michael Camille, and next to him, you can see dear my dear friend and former student, Andrew Tallon and Francois Boucher. So the whole idea of a vast overview is intriguing. And you might want to ask our Goths to start to arrange themselves according to their intellectual underpinnings, but perhaps mercifully, that's not going to happen. So in order to point up the modernity of our modern Goths, we can, if we like, contrast them with our older Goths. The older Goths begin with Abbot Suger and an image that represents Villa de Uncourt, I think the oldest Goths, and I've got Vasari and Raphael as anti-Goths in there. And you can pick out your favorite older Goths here. Paul Frankel is in there, you can find him, and Panofsky and Otto Sedelmeier up there in the top left-hand corner. Now, seriously, what I'd actually like to do here is to reflect on my own historiographical odyssey over, it's almost exactly half a century of my immersion in the enterprise, in the Gothic enterprise. And particularly, I'd like to reflect on how those experiences involved my teacher, Peter Kidson, as well as my dear friend, and colleague Paul Crossley. In September 1967, I first came to the Courtauld Institute. This was, of course, the old Courtauld home house, with Anthony Blunt presiding, Joan and Amy at the reception desk at the front door there, and Peter Kidson up in the heights in his office up there in the Conway Library. It was only much later that I could begin to fully realize what an extraordinary time this was for the study of Gothic architecture. The middle decades of the 20th century saw, in addition to prolific publishing of an archaeological kind, a succession of attempts to reach the great synthesis. I'm thinking particularly of Owen Panofsky's Abbot Suger, his Gothic architecture and scholasticism, Hans Segelmeyer's Die Entstehung der Kathedrale, 1950, Jean Bonny's French cathedrals that he did with Earlyman in 1961, which in a sense anticipated his subsequent masterpiece, the 1984 French Gothic architecture. Also von Simpson's Gothic cathedral, that was 1962. Paul Frankel's The Gothic, 1960. His Gothic architecture from 1962. Hans Janssen's High Gothic of 1962. I would include in this list Willibald Saulender's attempt to create a unified story of Gothic sculpture in von Sansby, Strasbourg, a talk he delivered at the Courtauld, and he was countered memorably by Christopher Huller after the talk. However, in the conversations that developed in our seminar meetings on High Gothic in 1968 to 9, I was in a seminar with Peter Kidson, and there were only three of us, myself and Roger Stalley and David McLeese. There was very little appetite for the quest to establish the big theory of Gothic architecture, whether Neoplatonic Dionysian light hierarchy, or scholastic dialectic, or Frankel's immanent process. Peter was not ready to concede anything at all to Segelmeyer, but in fact he told us not to read it, but showed deep admiration of Bonny. I remember that for a while we attempted to apply the notion of the thick wall, thin wall dialectic to Gothic buildings, but you know, it really didn't work. The seminal works I've mentioned did not provide the bread and butter of our conversations, which were structured rather around a procession of great monuments, starting with Saint-Denis and ending somewhere towards 1300. The presentations were profusely illustrated by heaps of photographs from the Conway Library. No slides were ever shown, and they culminated in an unforgettable field trip to France during a snowy Easter in 1969 with Peter Kidson, Peter Draper, and the seminar, Amanda Tomlinson came along. Unforgettable experience. Certainly, there was one giant figure who pervaded our conversations. And who was that? Robert Branner. His Burgundian Gothic architecture came out in 1960, Bourges in 1962, St. Louis and the Court style in 1965. I know of no other scholar of Gothic who published so much in so few years. At one point at Columbia, I had the task of looking in Robert Branner's file. I was looking for some student information, and I've forgotten the date, but in addition to one of his big books, he had 3 or so substantial articles out at the same time, an astonishing productivity. Asked why Branner seemed so omnipresent in our conversations, Peter told me that he considered Branner the scholar most worthy of our critical attention. However, it was not so much the big ideas proposed by Branner, his notion of the court style, for example, or the Romanesque accelerants of Gothic architecture, but it was more the treatment of individual buildings that seemed to preoccupy us at the time. Peter was already aiming his sights at Bourges Cathedral. I can remember those extended examinations and debates around the masonry sutures flanking the radiating chapels of Bourges, both in the seminar room and on site. Peter already seemed to need to counter Branner's suggestion that those chapels had been added. Peter insisted that they had not been added. Peter must have been beginning to plot his critical review of Bourges, which was to appear in Gesta in 2000. I'm particularly happy to say that it was published as part of a symposium I had organized at Columbia to celebrate the work of Robert Branner, and Peter came and delivered his Bourges critique that he was already working on when we were students with him back in the 1960s. As we all now know, that great period of synthesis was followed by a series of deconstructive blasts. I wonder if Peter was already beginning to work out his rebuttal of Panofsky's Abbot's Suggère that appeared in the 1987 Warburg and Courtauld journal. Here, Peter Kidson contributed mightily to the barrage of deconstructive challenges to the great syntheses of the mid-century. I think of this reaction as beginning with Willibald Saulender's Mod Gothic. It gave us the title of our symposium. Mod Gothic appeared in the New York Review of Books in 1984. It was, I think, all too easy to deconstruct Bonny as a modernist who appreciated spaciousness more than the tombs, screens, and liturgical furniture that accumulated in Gothic space. And I have to confess that, like Bonny, I admire the Amiens nave. I would have admired it much more without the lateral chapels, which actually do a great deal of damage to the meaning and to the spacious policy of the building. So I always had a sneaking admiration for Bonny's conservative spaciousness. But more serious in Bonny, as far as I was concerned, was the lack of historical and contextual narrative in Bonny's big story, as well as the relative absence of human beings, the users and the makers of churches and cathedrals. I'm struck by the fact that Paul Crossley's critical overview of the field in 1988 emphasized the limitations of attempts to establish meaning in medieval buildings rather than the exciting possibilities offered by, for example, Krautheimer's notion of an iconography of architecture, which I still consider a rock in our shifting ocean. And then in 1994, Michael Camille added his censorious voice in the anthology edited by John van Engen to the chorus of disapproval of mid-century architectural scholarship, mocking the architectural historian's interest in measuring and establishing the dimensions of the building being studied. Camille's disapproval of the intense study of the physical fabric of the edifice formed part of a wider move against archaeology in American universities in these years. I think of the 1980s and the 1990s as almost a crisis in art history in the United States. Hans Belting's End of the History of Art, that first appeared in German in 1987, was then translated into English. And it was a hard time for archaeology. I can remember in my own department, we discussed for a while taking the term archaeology off the title of the department. Columbia has a department of art history and archaeology. So these were tumultuous times. I want to mention three publications of the second part of the 20th century, which offered simultaneously a sense of critical dissatisfaction with the immediate past. Those are Bonny's words in his big book, but also provided useful mechanisms for moving the discipline forward. The most ambitious attempt in these years was Didi Kimpel and Robert Stucala's monumental Die Gotische Architektur in Frankreich. There you can see them. I can't point with my cursor here, but they are towards the left of the screen in the lower levels, Didi Kimpel and Robert Stucala. The authors rejected the study of stylistic development of the kind proposed in Faucillon's Life of Forms or Frankel's Immanent Process. Instead, they favored conscious choice of forms on the part of builders, lending meaning to the structure. This might mean the choice of significant prototypes in the spirit of Krautheimer, or it might mean the progressive intensification of forms, like a Steigerung, producing a crescendo as one moves through the building. This notion already, the notion of a ductus or a moving through the work of art. The authors were, however, I think, over-assertive in applying this explanation to the differences between, for example, the crypt and the upper choir of Saint-Denis, or between the nave and the choir of Amiens Cathedral, where certainly the changes of form at Amiens were not part of a pre-planned intention to privilege the liturgical place of the choir. However, particularly attractive in Kimpel and Sukala was the emphasis upon political context and upon the technology of construction. It's a shame this book has never been translated into English. Soon after Kimpel and Sukala, Christopher Wilson, for whom I could find no image, I'd like to have him in my gallery here. Christopher Wilson offered an overview of Gothic. This is the 1990 Gothic Cathedral. That was really refreshingly wide-ranging, including Italy, Germany, England, and Spain over an extended time span, with a nice section on late Gothic, and with a readiness to rethink major monuments like Suger's Saint-Denis, where he wanted flying buttresses, and I do agree with him there, and Notre Dame of Paris, where I later established that there were indeed flying buttresses in the choir of Notre Dame. And thirdly, Michael Davis, you can see him in the middle, right next to Peter Kidson at the bottom of my row. And third, Michael Davis in Sic et Non, his 1999 article, which I admire enormously, reviewed the conflicting demands made on the architecture historian, that is to say, intensive study of the building itself versus interdisciplinary readings and critical theoretical consciousness. In fact, Davis takes Camille's dismissive approach as a starting point. And Davis concluded quite rightly that we must do all of the above. It can't be this or that, sic et non. Now, in this mid to late 20th century atmosphere of scholarly push and shove, how was the young architecture historian, the PhD candidate, to start out and move forward? But before I address this question, I should mention here an exciting interlude, a kind of préhistoire in my life as an art historian, which proved formative, that is to say, my affair with Armenian church architecture. In 1966, at the end of my first year at Oxford, I and 3 companions set out in an old Land Rover to explore Armenia, particularly the abandoned city of Ani. Here, the map shows us our route. We circled the Black Sea and we came across the Soviet Union through Soviet Georgia, Soviet Armenia at the height of the Cold War. Crazy enterprise at the time. And the trip culminated in a memorable stay. We had about 5 days or so camping in the abandoned city of Ani. We took our wind-up Bell and Howell movie camera and a flimsy tripod. We aimed to make a documentary for BBC's Traveller's Tales. It never got aired, of course. Attempting to prepare myself for the trip, I came across, in the Oxford Library, the writings of Josef Stregowski, Die Baukunst der Armenier, and in translated form, The Origins of Christian Church Art. Here was the theory of everything, an explanation of Western European medieval architecture in terms of the contrast between the dynamism of muscular vaulted buildings imported from the East, as opposed to the effete old wooden roof basilicas of Rome. My illusions were thankfully, very thankfully, short-lived. The only Byzantinist in Oxford at that time was Father Gervase Matthew at Blackfriars. I couldn't find a picture of him, Gervase Matthew. When I eagerly recounted to Father Gervase Matthew my encounters with Stregowski, his response was simple and even brutal. He said, just go and use your eyes. And I seem to remember he pushed me off the front doorstep of Blackfriars, but certainly there was an abrupt ending to the conversation. He did not approve of Stregowski, quite rightly so. Similarly, my own Oxford tutor, Eric Stone, after I presented my Stregowski saturated essay in the College History Society, quietly gave me an off-print to go and read by myself. It was Ward Perkins's rebuttal of Stregowski's Orient Ode to Rome. So I began my art historical odyssey with a deep sense of skepticism about big theories. So I set out on my dissertation fieldwork in 1969. Not quite Kingsley Porter's Rolls-Royce. The motorcycle was my key means of transport. I once took Peter Kidson on the back of that motorcycle from the Courtauld Institute down to the antiquaries, and I think he was quite elated by the possibility of dashing through the London traffic. Not quite Kingsley Porter's Rolls Royce, but on the back of the motorcycle, I had room for only one book to guide me around the monuments of northern France. Now, what should this book be? Not Hans Janssen, who broke up the great cathedrals into their component parts for analysis. At that time, Paul Frankel seemed to offer the most complete narrative of Gothic, with some adequate treatment of the buildings themselves. But I experienced Frankel's limitations in Reims, where I lost much time searching for the Church of Saint-Nicaise. Frankel had written of this monument long since, as if it was really still there. But the reading that gave me most inspiration, embarking on the dissertation, for the actual work I was about to do in the field, was Jan van der Merlen's 1965 critical review of the theories of Frankel and Grudecki relating to the construction of Chartres Cathedral. I could not find an image of Jan van der Merlen. As you probably know, he was Walter Leidy's colleague at Cleveland for quite a while and had a number of students there at Cleveland. But he published his piece in the Mémoires de la Société archéologique d'Ur et Loire in 1965. And in this article, to resolve the futile debate over whether construction at Chartres moved from west to east or the other way around, Jan van der Merlen insisted on the intense analysis of the stones themselves. Such work demands complete immersion in the building. In Troyes Cathedral, my first love in Gothic, I found that this immersion, really a physical one, could be an extraordinarily enjoyable, even a compulsive experience. Plaisir du monument is quite similar in some ways to the plaisir du texte. Both involve the intense pleasure to be derived in unscrambling a complex plot. Insinuating oneself into a flying buttress was, of course, not enough. One had to be able to unravel and tell its exciting story, a most unexpected story, as it turns out, but more on this later. Certainly, in the business of looking critically at the monument and writing about it, Kidson and Boni were the guiding lights. Both displayed that dazzling ability to make a building come alive through the apt deployment of words. Kidson was particularly good at looking at a building as the process of becoming. Yet when it came to establishing the analytical underpinnings for a dissertation in architectural history, I found myself returning to my initial grounding in medieval economic history. At Keble College, seen here on the screen, my tutor, Eric Stone, had shown me the possibility of manipulating a mass of statistical data in order to detect underlying changes in human relationships that otherwise would remain invisible. No picture of Stone available. I'm showing you his office space, and there he didn't publish much, but his piece on the profit and loss accountancy on the estates of Norwich Cathedral Priory is a little bit the equivalent of Peter Kidson's meteorological investigation, long and complex, the kind of thing you want to read and reread and read and read again. So I avidly read and reread his seminal article in the Transactions of the Royal Historical Society on profit and loss accounting. Through an intense reading of manorial accounts, contracts, legal documents, and other written evidence, Stone was able to demonstrate the surprising development and application in 12th century England of an entrepreneurial attitude to the exploitation of the land, with a view to making a cash profit, more associated with early capitalism than with the so-called feudal system. In other words, the underlying dynamics of social relationships might be shifting radically while surface appearances and institutions remain the same. Stone's approach to dynamic change in history related his work to a constellation of scholars that included Frank Stenton, F.M. Maitland, and the founding figure in some ways of this stream of thought in England was Paul Vinogradov. But it was with the work of Ada Levitt, seen here on the left, that I saw the possibility of moving the understanding of architecture as more than the result of historical forces. The construction of a great building can actually change society and change history. Thus, Levitt raised the possibility that rapid social change on the 14th century estates of the See of Winchester could have been driven not by Black Death, but by the need for cash to finance the bishop's extensive building campaigns. The desire to employ administrative records in a statistical way to illustrate the dynamics of the relationship between large-scale building and society led me at Oxford to Howard Colvin, that most generous of scholars at St. John's College, and to the work of James Ackerman, whose 1949 article, Ars Scientia Nihil Est, provided a key inspiration in the possibility of correlating text with edifice. Colvin sent me to the British Museum to study the building accounts of Troyes Cathedral, and I found there a treasure trove of material from which to construct the economic and human dynamics of cathedral building. I'm showing you here not a fabric account or a building account of Troyes, because my photographs are old and grainy and boring. A couple of years ago, I photographed the one surviving building account for Amiens Cathedral. It's the most exciting thing. It's a roll, it's not a codex, it's a parchment roll. The accounts of Troyes are on paper and are codices. And there, before you, you can see a double column system. On the left are the receipts. It begins with the little prologue that describes who the person rendering it is. The accountant, his name is Jacobus Parvus, so we'll call him Little Jim, I guess. And the total receipts are shown there, £430. There is a master mason named. He is named under the expense sections you'd expect. On the right-hand side, about, I think, second line down, you can see Magister Renaldus written out there. He is named as master, and he receives his sum of money each year in lieu of a robe. A master mason had an honorific position and had a robe each year presented to him, although the sum was normally commuted and paid in cash. So you've got Master Renaldus. The glazier is identified, Guilelmus, and the work, you can construe the work was, you can deduce that it was on the nave chapels. But look at the date, 1357 to 8. The Battle of Poitiers had just taken place. And it's similarly at Troyes, while the Battle of Agincourt was taking place, they were busy debating the form of the new steeple to be built over the crossing. Monumental building and history are curiously not connected in some ways. You'd expect everything to come to a grinding halt after such a defeat as Poitiers. So it was the correlation of such written sources with the forms of the building itself that unlocked the story of the cathedral. And incidentally, it unlocked the story of that flying buttress that captivated me on my first visit to Troyes. You can see the drawing I made of it on the bottom left-hand side. Those are the days before laser measuring, and it's a section I measured out myself by dropping a plumb bob with a lead weight attached to a 50-meter steel tape through all the keystones and plotting the building in that way. There's the diagram, and there on the upper right side, you see the very flying buttress itself that I was interested in. And can you look just one flying buttress beyond that? You're right adjacent to the south transept, and look at this. What had caught my eye is it's the only crooked flying buttress in the whole building. And that was so memorable. I had to find some explanation. And there it turned up in the archive. There at the bottom, you can see the text that allows you to explain this curious hunchback flyer in terms of a visit that took place in 1362, where a visiting master whose name was Pierre Fazon, appropriately named, came and said, well, it's all very well, but your master mason, Jean de Tourvois, has built his flyers too high. And this is to do with the upper flyer, which has to be taken down and reworked, reusing the old masonry. And that's indeed what happened. The upper flyer was taken down, reusing the old masonry and put back again. But damn it, it didn't work. And the nave fell down a few years later. And so the whole system had to then be rebuilt again. So these very curious flyers that you see here are the result of this history that you would never know about had you not had access to those written sources. In a sense, Jean Bonny invited us to look for the surprises in the development of Gothic architecture. But without written sources, it's sometimes hard to find those surprises. It's when you put the sources together with the building that the surprises begin to emerge. But where is Paul Crossley in my story? At the Courtauld, Paul came into our lives from Cambridge as an external advisee of Peter Kidson. I have to say that our seminar group at the Courtauld was not the most joyful company, but Paul's presence always seemed somehow celebratory. He seemed to take such enormous pleasure in what he was doing. I mean, it's a pleasure I found later myself. I wasn't aware of it so much at the time, but the pleasure of complete engagement in buildings. I know little of Paul's education at Cambridge, but he appeared to come into the discipline able to deal with both monuments and historical contexts. This with the added difficulty of the Polish language. And in addition to this, he quickly developed the ability to undertake the kind of intellectual mapping of the world of architectural theory that lay behind his seminal 1988 article and that equipped him for the monumental task of editing the Frankel volume. I have to tell you here of an odd circumstance. In the early 1970s, after I'd left London for Indiana University at Bloomington, I received a letter from Nicholas Pevsner asking me to edit a new edition of Gothic architecture. But I was, of course, by then happily engaged with my work at Troyes. Essentially, I did not want to climb out of my flying buttress, and so I respectfully declined. There can be no doubt that Paul did a much better job than I ever could have. However, having continued my passionate engagement with cathedrals, now Beauvais, now Amiens, and fleetingly Notre Dame of Paris, and my digital mapping projects, I increasingly felt that something essential was missing from a scholarly approach which tended to treat monument as essentially separate from ourselves, to be objectively dissected as if on an operating table. Moreover, the passionate process of investigation and discovery in the building, which I tried to sketch with my flying buttress, that's a compulsive thing. You're really led forward like reading an excellent novel. But that process is separated by a great rift from the desiccated pages of a book. Can a cathedral even be put into a book at all, even a large format book with glossy paper, so heavy that it can hardly be carried? So what is the aspiring architecture? What is the aspiring historian of architecture to do? Three things, I believe, are necessary. First, as Michael Davis rightly suggested, we must ignore the border police and get beyond the sick known. Willibald Sauerländer told us in that Princeton symposium not to read Cyrenai's Dionysius, but rather to read the ordinaries. We must, of course, do both. Second, we should experiment with ways to move beyond our position as objective scientists and recognize more fully our own implication in the building, exploring its multiple changing layers of significance in relation to its makers and users. I particularly like Lindy Grant's insistence that we seek out the personal history of the builders, chercher l'évêque. Also, of great potential value, I believe, is the study of devotional and liturgical practices. I think particularly here of the work of Paul Binsky and Caroline Brasilius. Caroline is next to, that's Hans Belting in my bottom left-hand corner. I appointed him as an honorary Goth. The best chapter in my own most recent and last book on Amiens that came out last year is the one on liturgical performance. And thirdly, I think we still have to work harder in a critically self-conscious manner to establish an appropriate mechanism to string buildings together in order to tell the great story. The problem is that we tend to tell the audience what Gothic actually is at the beginning with a list of characteristics, and then to track how buildings become progressively more Gothic. This is entelechy, a self-fulfilling prophecy, and is inherently boring. Bonny declared his intention to bring out the unexpected in the working out of Gothic, yet his dialectical narrative does not deliver that elusive entity. He fell into the entelechy trap. And if we declare the term Gothic taboo and attempt to construct a purely historical structure, we've lost something essential to our story. Interestingly, the very last time I heard Paul Crossley give a lecture, this was at Columbia a few years ago, it was on the importance of a critically self-conscious approach to the narrative of Gothic. This at a time when I was publishing my own Plotting Gothic essay, which is also essentially about storytelling. Paul Crossley and I were born in the same year, 1945, and our lives, quite different and yet parallel, were constructed far apart. It was intriguing and gratifying then in our last interaction to find that we'd both arrived at such a very similar point in our respective quests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, both for that really fascinating story, but also for putting us all together in the same space in that way. I'm going to offer now just a few closing remarks, but there will be some time to discuss Stephen's paper after those remarks. So I'm going to try, I had some problems with my audio before, so if someone could let me know if there's an issue, in which case I will turn off my video, but hopefully you can see my screen now. So let me open, as it were, these closing remarks just with some comments about the time when I first met Paul, which was in the Conway Library at the Courtauld. Though actually I didn't really meet him at all. It was the summer before I began my MA. It was my first ever visit to the Conway in the days when the Conway still occupied the grand first floor rooms in Somerset House. And a man came in and started gossiping loudly with Lindy, then the Conway librarian. And as some of you will probably remember, there was no soundproofing in the old Conway Library, so every word could always be heard. And Paul, of course, was a great gossiper, and I'm not averse to it myself. And I think probably Lindy would admit that she enjoys it sometimes too. But as I was eavesdropping, it gradually dawned on me that this must be Paul Crossley, my future tutor. He had popped in, he said to Lindy, in order to finalize images for an article he was completing. And to my earnest ears at that time, this seemed so very glamorous, this man so incredibly charming, that I was far too nervous to introduce myself as the MA student he'd accepted but hadn't yet met. Now, of course, I've long since been disabused of my glamorous notions of academic life. But even now, if I see a photo of Paul or read a passage of that wonderful, luminous prose, I can hear and feel again that extraordinary charm that so many people have alluded to today. PK I met only once, so I knew him principally from Paul's growling, rocking, but affectionate impressions, and from so many stories by PK's former students. And to be frank, I've always been rather intimidated by those stories, not just because of the clear sense of a razor intellect and dedicated teacher, but also because it seems as though under PK and under Paul too, medieval architecture seemed to be sprinkled with a kind of magic dust. There's seems to me like a kind of golden moment for the study of medieval architecture. And I have to be honest that in some ways this conference, which is actually something I've wanted to do for many years, is for me partly an attempt to understand that magic in the hope that it can be sustained in the face of so many competing pressures. And I'm sure a lot of it had to do with those amazing trips, but much else besides. So we've heard over the last 2 days about travel, photography, letters, scholars and students, about big ideas sometimes and the friendships and animosities that help to shape architectural history in the 20th century. For me, this photo here that you see of Paul at Chartres on the left sums up so much about the way he thought and taught, the joys of looking closely and collectively, and the scholarship that informs so much of that looking. And on trips, as many will remember, particularly when he was teaching, Paul always carried around a great pile of notes, photocopies and books, sometimes clutched to his chest, often weighing down that heavy leather satchel that he used to carry around. And as I think has been alluded to already today, like his glasses, those notes seem to serve chiefly as rhetorical props. But they were also, I think, a kind of a legacy, a hangover of the many hours he dedicated to preparing for trips, classes and lectures, because as is so often the case, that kind of sprezzatura that he radiated disguised a great deal of hard toil. And Paul enjoyed a profound regard for the scholarship of others and a fascination with the emergence and evolution of ideas, big and small. That regard is seen most obviously in his revision of Paul Frankel's somewhat kind of dastardly text on Gothic architecture, and Paul's endlessly useful but characteristically modest endnotes to it. But it's also seen in Paul's own publications, including some of the publications that have been referred to today, including his important reviews of the iconography of medieval architecture and the integrated cathedral, but also, I think, in a series of essays he published in the latter part of his career, often focused on one or two major scholars and their relationship to medieval art or architecture. Pesner, Gombrich, Warburg, Frankel, even Bechmann, if we can call him a major scholar. These, I have to say, are some of my favorite essays because they show so clearly the breadth of Paul's interests and his particular fascination for the period from the 1930s onwards. Paul was also a great reviewer of books. And if you cannot read every item on this not quite complete list of his reviews, I've tried to update it at the bottom right, but I know that there are a few things missing. This comes from the book that Achim Timmerman and Zoe Parchich edited a few years ago and gave to Paul. But even if you can't read all of these entries, you can, I think, nonetheless sense that there are very many of them. It's now almost impossible to measure the anonymous and largely thankless task of the peer reviewing of book manuscripts and articles by Paul or any other academic, all the hours given over to editorial tasks. But I want to take this moment, because frankly, when else does it happen, to celebrate those who take the time to review books for their commitment to engaging closely with new scholarship, drawing attention to important new ideas, and especially in Paul's case and PK's case, actually, especially those published in other languages, and also correcting weaker ideas when required. And Paul's reviews, as we might expect, and as many of you I'm sure will know, are penetrating and generous. But he was also impatient with pomposity, laziness, or feeble thinking. And lest you think that Paul was all sweetness and light, go and read his devastating review published in the Burlington in 1994 of Clark and Radding's Medieval Architecture, Medieval Learning, Builders and Masters in the Age of Romanesque and Gothic. It's really quite brutal and shows what Paul could do when he wanted to. Paul's approach to earlier scholars was partly inspired by PK's, as we've already seen, who liked to read buildings through their interlocutors, medieval and modern. And he too was a prolific reviewer for over 50 years. And at the same time, his obituaries of scholars like Holler, Zanetsky, Burney, and others are both affectionate and enlightening too. Both of them, Paul and PK, offer this kind of daunting history of reviews over many decades. but which speak to their continuing engagement with the field. And I'm really delighted to share here the news that Alexander Gajewski, who is now rather appropriately the reviews editor at the Burlington magazine, is planning to collect together all of PK and Paul's many reviews for Burlington and circulate them as a PDF. And when she does so, we will certainly advertise this. So one view holds that historiography is biography plus bibliography. In the last months of his life, Paul, partly prompted by others, was worried about the fate of his books. And so Zoe, Alexandra, and I went to see him in Bletsoe, and as there was little time to assess them properly, I took a few photos of them, never really thinking what I would do with those afterwards. But here you can see some of them in his study in Bletsoe, old friends and witnesses to his varied interests. Here are the great books and big ideas about Gothic architecture that Stephen just referred to, including Paul's own copy of Paul Frankel's collection of sources on the Gothic, a project after Paul's own heart and a book that he cherished with particular intensity. Here also are the books on Gothic art and architecture in Poland, Bohemia, and Central Europe, the stuff of his doctoral thesis and so much after. And here are the copies of his students' PhD theses, together with Paul's collection of Pesner's books on music, philosophy, German Baroque architecture, and 20th century history and thought. His library, in a sense, sums up his intellectual journey. But he also wants to give a few of his books to us. And looking through them, many of them preserve letters, affectionate dedications and jokes, precious relics of friendships and intellectual companionship. I'm pleased to say that in the end, a happy arrangement was reached with one of Paul's former PhD students, Michalis Olympios, and over 1,500 of Paul's books were ultimately shipped to Cyprus, where they helped to fill a library with otherwise slim prospects of ever acquiring some of these seminal texts. All those books have now been catalogued and record their donation by Paul. And Michalis has also written a lovely text about Paul and his books that you can see here on the screen. They will, it is hoped, help to sustain future generations of students and scholars in Cyprus, and who knows, perhaps might even produce an unexpected theme of Cypriot scholarship on the architecture of Central Europe. So, as we've seen in enlightening detail in the last few days, we reconstruct the past from scraps, from fragmentary building accounts, scarred churches, long-lost lecture notes, faded photos, incomplete photocopies, and sometimes tattered books. Both Paul and PK cared about big ideas, but they were also fascinated with the intellectual ancestry of those ideas and understood that they were shaped by people, by their friendships and foibles, their insights and agonies. And so as we finish now for our final discussion of this conference, I want to thank all of those who shared their ideas and memories in the last 2 days, as well as Acacia and those in the Courtauld Research Forum and elsewhere who've made this conference possible, and everyone in this Zoom audience for joining. And in my mind's eye, I drink with old friends in the past and to a time when we can all be together in the future. So thank you. So with that, we really kind of conclude the conference. But if anyone has any questions for Stephen or comments, then do please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I think we can all be released for a cold beer or anything else.